March 19, 1997. A helicopter thunders low over the rainforest of East Kalimantan on the island of Borneo. Below, a search party wades through mud and vines. They are looking for a man named Michael de Guzman, chief geologist for a small Canadian mining company. He never lands. 2 years earlier, almost nobody had heard of Bre-X Minerals. It traded as a penny stock in Calgary, worth pennies a share, run by a Montreal-born promoter named David Walsh. Walsh had failed at oil, failed at real estate, and by 1993 was living on credit cards. He had one asset left, a claim in the Indonesian jungle called Busang, staked years earlier on a hunch that it sat near an old Dutch gold survey. He needed a geologist who could sell a dream to investors. He found one in Michael de Guzman, a Filipino mining engineer with a reputation for finding gold where others had given up. De Guzman drilled Busang and reported traces of gold, then more. Then, by 1995, the numbers stopped looking like traces and started looking like a miracle. Every new core sample came back richer than the last. Walsh took the results to Toronto, then to Wall Street, then to the pages of the Northern Miner and the Wall Street Journal. Analysts flew in. Geologists toured the site. Nobody found a reason to doubt it. By early 1996, Bre-X estimated Busang held 30 million ounces of gold. By the end of that year, the estimate had climbed past 70 million ounces. Some analysts whispered it could be the largest gold deposit ever discovered. The stock followed the estimates upwards. Shares that had traded for pennies climbed past $200, adjusted for splits. Bre-X became the most actively traded stock on the Toronto Stock Exchange. Pension funds bought in. Small investors mortgaged homes to buy in. David Walsh, once broke, was worth hundreds of millions on paper. Company executives cashed out stock options along the way, quietly, a little at a time. Nobody asked too many questions, because the drill results kept coming back exactly as rich as everyone hoped. Then, in late 1996, the Indonesian government stepped in. Under President Suharto, officials pressured Bre-X to bring in a major international partner to develop the mine, a company with the money and expertise to actually build it. Freeport-McMoRan, an American mining giant with deep experience in Indonesia, agreed to take a stake and run its own due diligence. That meant drilling its own samples, independent of anything Bre-X had reported. In February 1997, Freeport's geologists arrived at Busang. Their early results did not match Bre-X's numbers, not close. Where Bre-X reported thick veins of gold, Freeport found almost nothing. The gap was too large to explain by normal variation between drill holes. Freeport kept testing, quietly, and kept getting the same answer. Someone needed to explain the discrepancy, and fast, because Bre-X shares were still trading near their peak. That is where Michael de Guzman comes back into the story. On March 19, 1997, he boarded a company helicopter, reportedly headed to Busang to meet with Freeport's team and address the growing questions about the assays. Partway through the flight, according to the pilot, de Guzman fell. His body was found 4 days later in the jungle, badly decomposed, identified in part by a missing set of teeth that matched his dental records. Indonesian authorities ruled it a suicide. He had reportedly left behind letters, though accounts of their exact contents vary, and some described him as suffering from hepatitis and depression. Rumors began immediately that de Guzman had staged his own death, or that someone else had staged it for him. Whatever happened in that helicopter, the company he worked for could no longer explain away the growing gap between its numbers and Freeport's. In early May 1997, an independent lab called Strathcona Mineral Services released its own review of the core samples. Their conclusion was blunt. The gold in the samples had not come from the rock at Busang. It had been added afterwards, ground down from placer gold, the kind panned from riverbeds, mixed into the crushed core samples before they were sent for testing. Someone had spent years salting the evidence. Strathcona called it, in their report, one of the most elaborate frauds in the history of mining. There was no 70 million ounces. There was, by some estimates, barely any gold at all. The stock did not fall, so much as vanish. Bre-X shares, once worth billions of dollars combined, dropped to almost nothing within days. Trading was halted, then resumed, then collapsed further. Pension funds in Quebec and Ontario lost hundreds of millions of dollars. Individual investors who had believed in the story, some of whom had bought in, specifically because so many experts had toured the site and vouched for it, lost their savings overnight. The Ontario Securities Commission, the RCMP, and regulators insisted several countries opened investigations. So did prosecutors in the United States. David Walsh maintained until the end that he had been deceived along with everyone else, that he never knew the samples were salted. He moved to the Bahamas, where Bre-X had relocated its corporate address for tax reasons before the collapse. In May 1998, just over a year after the fraud was exposed, Walsh died suddenly of a brain aneurysm. He was 52 years old. He was never charged with a crime. John Felderhoff, the company's chief geologist and the man most publicly associated with the Busang results, faced insider trading charges in Ontario, accused of selling shares while allegedly aware the results were suspect. The case dragged through Canadian courts for years, one of the longest and most complicated fraud trials in the country's history. In 2007, a decade after the collapse, a judge acquitted him of all charges, citing insufficient evidence that he personally knew about the salting. To this day, no one has ever been criminally convicted for the Bre-X fraud. Investigators concluded that de Guzman and a small circle of field geologists in Indonesia were most likely responsible for physically salting the samples, adding placer gold to core after core over a period of years to keep the results climbing. But de Guzman was dead before the fraud was exposed, and the two Filipino technicians who worked most closely with him were never located for questioning. Whether de Guzman acted alone or on someone else's orders has never been established with certainty. The Busang site itself, the jungle clearing that briefly promised to be the richest gold deposit on Earth, produced almost no gold at all. Geologists who studied the underlying rock afterwards found that its geology made a deposit of that size essentially impossible. It had never been the biggest gold find in history. It had never been a gold find at all, beyond what people put there themselves. For years afterwards, mining companies pointed to Busang as the reason due diligence exists, the reason independent verification matters, no matter how many experts sign off on a claim. Business schools still teach it as a case study in how a good story, told confidently enough for long enough, can move billions of dollars before anyone checks the rock itself. Some questions from Busang were never closed. The exact circumstances of Michael de Guzman's death remain disputed by people who worked the case, some of whom have never accepted the official account. The identity of everyone involved in the salting was never fully established, and somewhere in the paperwork of a fraud that fooled banks, governments, and some of the sharpest analysts on Wall Street, one signature keeps coming up: the geologist who never lived to answer for it. He was identified by his teeth.